We're continuing in the Gospel of Matthew, the 14th chapter. I am convinced that you're all going to be tired of this by the end, but this is the way Jesus works. Again and again and again, the stories bear witness to the Word of God, not just the story itself. Today, as we read this part of Matthew 14, I want you to focus on the interplay between Jesus and Peter. This is after Jesus has sent them out in a boat and gone away onto the mountaintop to pray and seen them from far off and come walking at the fourth watch of the night when it was very dark. And it says at about 2 in the morning, when the disciples saw Jesus walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage." Perhaps the greatest part about God's call over our lives is that we must be strong and courageous. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. The only one who answers is Peter. "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." And in verse 29, Jesus says, "Come. Come to the altar. Come to me, those who are burdened and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Come. That's all Jesus says. Come. And with one word, Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water as if it was nothing, and came to Jesus. But when Peter saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Today we're going to talk about call. And implicit in the understanding of call is that there is one who calls, and that we are called to listen. Peter literally is the only one who speaks to this ghost that is causing great fear and says, "Lord, if it's you, just let me know that it's you. And if it's you, you tell me to come. And what will I do? Come." That's already a statement of faith. I'm actually a little afraid to say to God, "If it's you, tell me to come and I'll be right there." Sometimes my problem is not hearing God tell me to come. It's finding the obedience to do as God calls. Last night I had the privilege of going to a Casting Crowns concert, and I didn't think this was going to be part of my sermon, but I have to tell you, the thing I love most about Casting Crowns is the lyrics to their music. It's actually, I learned last night why I love them so much. The lead singer of the Casting Crowns is, who is it, Mike? Mark Hall. Old dude stands up there, tells us his story. He says, "This is how it started. I started in a small Baptist church with my dad, who was a pastor, and my dad had a really great ability to sing. My dad could sing. Everybody in my family could sing. Everybody in the church sang." He said, "Even the people who served the coffee sang." That's clearly not Epworth. And he says, "I learned to sing. I didn't think it was such a big deal." And then later on in my life, he said, "I was 19 years old, and the only words he used was that the darkness came in." Anybody relate to a moment like that? Somehow, the darkness just came in. "I was 19, he said, "and I hadn't learned that if I don't know the stories of faith myself, if I don't speak to Jesus myself, no amount of church or my daddy or anybody else can teach me about Jesus." The words started to take root in my heart. He said, and I was eventually called to be a youth pastor. Okay, that feels like a pretty normal story, right? This is the part that caught me. He said, I started to pastor a community of teenagers that he still pastors today. And he said, in that process, I realized that, like me, many of the young people that I was working with couldn't wrap their heads and their hearts around the stories. And then he says about himself, as a child, I was diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD. I hated school, he said. This is his story, not mine. I hated it because I was in every special help class that existed, and I felt like at every turn I was the one that wasn't making it. And I remember walking into church as a child, and he said, this was a powerful statement. He said, when we walk into church, we often tend to see the thing we are most afraid of first. That'll preach. He said, and what did I see? A whole room of people carrying a bunch of books around. What a horrible thing, he thought. I have to read here too. And so as a youth pastor, he realized that the thing that was penetrating the hearts of his young people in a way that nothing else was music. So he started taking the scriptures and the stories that had made sense to him and contextualizing them in song and feeding them to the glory of God to the people that he was walking with. And it changed his life. And it changed the life of the teenagers. And then he became a fancy, famous singer. There's a documentary about casting crowns that is entitled Always Home by Sunday. Because, I never knew this, Mike Skinner. Mike loves this band. Because every one of the people that stand up there in this fancy concert understand that being in their local church on a Sunday to serve is more important than the concerts that they fill out. Always home by Sunday. So Mark Hall continues to be a youth pastor, and the woman on the keys is a children's ministry pastor somewhere else, and they all talk about the fact that they have been propelled to this place. In your call, God will magnify and multiply, and you will do things that you never could do in your own power, but they never lose sight of what? I got to be home by Sunday. I got to be home by Sunday, because on Sunday is where I am reminded who I am. In that story, there's a bunch of things that are important. We call this quick process. God, I want you to tell me what you want. I will get out of the boat. I will take the steps, and then we can live into this purpose. It never works like that. It is a process that requires starts and step backs and failures along the way. It is a process that is filled with the limitations that are part of who we are. And God uses the very places that you think block you, like his inability to read. God uses those and flips them around if we let God, for God's glory. Peter was the impetuous and the impulsive one who is the only one in that moment with the courage to speak to the ghost. And he says, Lord, if it's you, I have enough faith to follow. And Jesus says, come. And Peter gets out of the boat. I want you to think about your own life purpose. Don't use the word calling. For a minute, think about your vocation. Think about the place that is your sweet spot. Think about the things that give you joy and meaning and purpose. Think about the places that you don't understand why, but somehow there is a multiplication that happens. John Ortberg, in his book in chapter 3, tells what he calls an old Hasidic or conservative Jewish story, in which each one of us is commanded to wear a coat. Imagine yourself wearing a coat with two pockets. This old Jewish story says that in one pocket, you pull out a note from God. Would that it were that easy, right? Just put a note in my pocket, please. And on that first note, it says, of millions upon millions of grains of sand in the universe. You're just a teeny tiny speck in a spectrum of stars. You are one of millions of people that God has created, but you are one of so much. And you put the note back. And you take out the note in your other pocket. And that note from God says, I made the universe just for you. I made the universe just for you, Peter. You are one of millions upon millions. There will be many before you and many to come after, Peter. You are just one of many that are living into this call. But on the other hand, Peter, right now in this moment, I have made this whole thing for you. And the truth is, in many spiritual stories, both are true. God is wide and big and grand, and we are one of millions upon millions. And in moments that can make us feel minuscule and unimportant, or it can make us feel a part of a creation story that blows our imaginations. And on the other hand, God speaks individually, has purpose and calling for your life. You are not adrift on a sea without someone walking towards you. And that deep sense of calling, of purpose in our lives is to start to hone what God is speaking to us. Ortberg continues saying that the process of discerned understanding or claiming requires one of the greatest challenges of self-exploration and judgment a human being can undertake. To take inventory about our gifts and our limitations. It requires us to ask hard questions about where we are and where we've been. And sometimes it requires us to live in the obedience. And it says every single calling has some assembly required. And the process of living into that can be a process that we give up on way too easily. How many of you are sitting there right now saying, Pastor Jen, I don't hear Jesus like that. He's not talking to me. I've tried this Jesus thing. I've tried to listen to what he's saying, but I can't distinguish it, and it is maddening. So I will just continue to do what I'm doing. That comes when we've somehow been taught the lie that any failures or limitations or bumps along the road are evidence that it's not a calling. To the contrary, it is literally a walking with Jesus. Think about Peter. How many times does he get it wrong? And how many times does he get it right? How many questions does he have? And the faithfulness of that journey is that they don't stop walking together. Peter and Jesus. Pull one side of the note out of your pocket and pull the other one. I was reading an article published by The Atlantic recently that really ties into it. It talked about our young adult generation. Now, I actually don't think this is just a young adult problem, but the article was literally talking about how we as older generations have taught the younger generations that the most important value in life is not vocation, but it's success. You need to achieve, and nothing like Montgomery County to make it worse. You need to get the best grades. You need to go to the best school. You need to make a lot of money. You need to have relationships that strong family. You need to have success. And on some level, who doesn't want that for the next generation? Of course, I don't want my children to struggle with poverty. Of course, I want them to apply themselves and do their best. But the article says when the emphasis of our teaching is on success, the young people internalize the message that it's not really there, it's about the goods you deliver at the end. And it says, this article did, that actually creates a problem for both those who quote-unquote fail and those who succeed. For the ones who succeed, they get to the top. They get the very things we said were most important in their life, and they find at the pinnacle of success. And are they fulfilled? No. They realize just how empty and confusing those things are when it's not tied to a deep calling from God. And so they are confused and feel betrayed and angry and have missed The walking with God to get to that point. Perhaps even worse yet are all of those who felt like they failed along the way and gave up. I didn't succeed. I never will succeed. And I'll always be in this clump that cannot be redeemed. And there is nothing about Jesus that is in that. Our Hall said, when he was 19 and the darkness came in, he knew what everybody else thought about him. He knew what his church, he knew what his daddy thought about him. And he figured, I might as well at least figure out, what does Jesus think about me? The inverse of a focus on success is a focus on vocation. Where is the place that you feel this joy rising up in you? John Ortberg is the one who referenced that Psalm 19 scripture where literally as the heavens and the sun are coming out of their chamber, it's like a champion rejoicing to run his course. What is the journey that we are inviting each other to be on that is filled with the exhilaration of watching who you are intersect with God? John Ortberg asks if you are not engaged in something in your life that requires the power of God for you to accomplish it, you're not stepping out into the purpose that God has. Vocation is different than success. And when we lose sight of vocation, every failure becomes an end to the story. And if you open your Bibles, it never is an end in Scripture. There are some crazy people in the Bible. Crazy people. Read it. Right? The failures in life are never the end. When you are pursuing a vocation, they are the learning process that allows us to step in to the future. So let's go to Exodus 4. It's in your bulletins and obviously in your Bibles. Exodus 4, we have this encounter, this back and forth between Moses and God. And Moses says to the God who has called him. Now let's talk about who Moses is. Moses is a Hebrew in the context of the Egyptian Pharaoh's palace. Moses is the different one, the one who sees his Hebrewness, his adopted nature as perhaps something that is a barrier to whatever he is called to do. And God, as God always does, steps in right there at that place and says, Moses, you are the one that I am going to use to lead my people to freedom. Who's going to lead them to freedom? Moses or God? God is going to lead them to freedom. Which is why Mark Hall goes back to his little church. I don't know if it's little anymore. To his church. He remembers who the story is being written by. God says, I am going to bring my people out of Egypt, Moses, and I am going to use you. And Moses says, look, God, they will not believe me. They won't listen to me. You don't know what they think of me. You don't know what I've done. You don't know what I'm skilled at or not skilled at. They won't really believe me that you appeared. And God answers Moses in the most maddening of ways. God often answers this way. He says, what's in your hand? What does Moses say? What does he say? What's in his hand? A staff. God says, throw it down. Moses throws down the staff, and what happens? It becomes a snake. That part of the story I knew. I knew this part of the story. Then God says to Moses, what? What does God say? Reach down and pick it up. Except God gives some very explicit directions. Is Moses to pick it up from the head or the tail? The tail. Now, if you are a snake handler, just go with me for a moment, right? Okay, Rebecca's the snake handler here. If you are a snake, you are the person in your household, you are the person in your family that when there is a snake crawling along the floor, somebody says, will you please come pick it up? And the very first thing you do when you bend down to pick up, where do you pick it up from? The head. Why? Because if you pinch it right behind the neck area, it can't flip around and bite you. Pastor Tammy says you chop off its head. You could do that too. So you wouldn't chop off the tail, and you wouldn't grab it by the tail, because then it's still alive and it comes back to bite you. So why? I never paid attention to this till John Ortberg. Why does God tell Moses to pick it up by the tail? Because when you pick your calling up by the tail, when you pick the snake up by the tail, who has to intervene so that that serpent doesn't come back around and bite you? God does. If this was about you controlling your call, you'd hold it by the head. God says, pick it up by the tail, because I am the head, God says. I am the head of the body, head of your life. I am the head, not the tail. You pick up the tail. I have the head. So Moses picks it up by the tail. Does it flip around and bite him? No, it becomes a staff. Moses still is not convinced. I love this. We think that our failings and our doubts and the journey is what disqualifies us. The stories tell us otherwise. God says, fine, take your hand, put it in your bosom, pull it out, and what happens to Moses' hand? It's full of leprosy. It's white and the skin is flaking off. God says, put it back. Moses puts it back, pulls it back out. What happens to his hand? Totally restored. Moses still is not convinced. God says, fine, take some water from the Nile, pour it out in front of me, and what will it become? It'll become blood. And Moses is listening to, this is how God talks, and it's maddening, right? Meanwhile, Moses is trying to figure out how he's supposed to talk to the people of Israel, who are enslaved in Egypt. Finally, at the end, Moses comes clean in verse 10. Look, God, I am not the one in the past or now that is able to do this. I talk too slowly and I have a speech impediment. This is not my calling, God. You're wrong. And God's answer is what? Who made your mouth? Who made your body? Who is the one who made millions upon millions in this universe? And in verse 13, what does Moses say? Moses is unchanged. Lord, please send somebody else. This is the man that God uses to take all of Israel into the promised land. This is the way that calling works. It is this back and forth dialogue with God. It is this assessment of what our limitations are. Moses wasn't wrong. He did have a speech impediment. He couldn't use his eloquence to do it. He needed to rely on the power of God to multiply. As Ortberg says, if you are seeking to do everything in your life only with your power, you are not stepping out on faith. There has to be places that only by the grace of God are you able to do and be what you're being asked to become. The other thing that's powerful about this story is the way in which God is not offended by our questions. Peter says to Jesus, Lord, if it is you, command me to come. Jesus doesn't say, why are you talking back to me, son? He says, come. And Peter gets out and walks on water a few steps. And in that moment, Ortberg would argue it's exhilarating. Those times when your life feels like it's filled with wind and God is pushing it forward. And you say, now, Mark Hall would say the biggest challenge in those moments is to remember that rush of exhilaration comes not from your giftedness, but from what? God's presence. And as soon as Peter forgets that, what happens? He starts to sink. I want to close by suggesting that as we start to explore call, as we start to explore vocation and purpose and the places in our life, we so easily believe it's just about what we're supposed to do. What is our profession? I want to read for you 1 through 4. that talks about calling in a different way. This is Paul. Ephesians 4:1-4 says, Paul, I therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in calling to which you have been called. Walk worthy of God's presence in your life. Walk worthy of the fact that you have the wind of God's Spirit at your back. Walk worthy of the calling to which you have been called, and the qualities named are not the ones we like. There is nothing sexy about this, God. Humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. You are one body, one Spirit, called to one hope that belongs to your call. Peace. Have I walked in? Mike talked about forgiveness. Have I stood in patience and peace? That doesn't mean that there aren't moments in our life when we have to create clear boundaries and stand firm in what we understand to be what is right. But it means that it is not just about what we do or where we go or what we succeed at becoming. It is about how we are. And Mark Hall said last night, if you have heard God cultivate in your spirit are meant to be, you won't be able to help yourself in doing that with others. God is talking to you. Your life does matter. The universe was made for you. Ortberg says that we often cut ourselves off for not being faithful. How many of us do this? God, I don't hear you clearly enough. I'm not willing to get out of the boat. I think I have too little faith. I think that I've messed it up too many times. Ortberg says, it's not about whether we have too little faith. It's about whether and he says, the more times you trust are now grown enough to be out of the house, they think they are. And I was having a conversation with one of them about what to do in some circumstance. And I said, you know what? If the question, what would Jesus do, doesn't make enough sense to you yet, I certainly know enough to not suggest you ask what I would do, because I have lost credibility. I want you to think about the people you know who have walked in faith, the people you learned something from, the people who, now I looked at Miss G, it makes me cry. What would Miss G do? What would your grandfather do? What would your Nana do? What would Grandpa Max say about that? Not because any one of those people are perfect, but because when you have walked with God, you begin to develop the ability to trust one step at a time. Get out of the boat. Take the first step. Don't beat yourself up. And trust that there is a journey that you can make by the power of God.